Hi, everyone. We've had a 2 week break from our program and we're ready to get started again this evening, um, talking about trauma, abuse, and the trauma vortex. Now, um, long before I learned about what I'm going to share about you tonight, I was doing emotional healing work, again, based on spiritual guidance and on the idea that a person uh, had to go and really face and process through their emotions in order to heal. And I saw this happen over and over again. And it 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 was a very important part of this, but I actually had no real justification. I couldn't find books or materials that backed up what I was doing. I often had people criticized me that I was handling things wrong, that you didn't have to have people go through all that emotion in order to heal. But in my experience, I just saw that this had a profound effect on people. And so later on, I ran into some of the uh, work and references I'm going to talk about tonight that validated what I was doing. And so what I'm doing tonight is presenting you some information that helps you understand why the approach to emotional healing that I'm talking about actually works. Um, and that's one of the things I'm really interested in. Is I'm interested in what works. I'm not interested in theories. I'm not interested in ideas. If I don't find them to be workable, if I don't find them to actually yield results in the real world, I'm not just a theorist. I'm very much a pragmatist. I want to find things that actually work. And that's why I've gravitated towards the things that I teach in emotional healing, because I've actually found them work. They worked in my life. They've worked in the lives of people that I've worked with. So we've talked in this second module about anger. We've also talked about desire and grief, and we have talked about the positive purposes in these emotions and how we use them incorrectly. Anger being kind of the gut level emotion that we're out of balance, grief, the heart level, and fear, the mental level. And fear is probably the kingpin. Love is the sense of connection with others. Love is the sense of connection with other people. Love is the sense of connection with nature. Love is the sense of connection with God. And that sense of connection creates a good feeling of happiness, joy, peace, etc. The sense of disconnection, which is rooted in fear, okay, is where anger comes from, where grief comes from, where all of our negative feelings come from, is the sense that we're disconnected, the sense we're cut off, the sense we're divided, and it all stems in judgment. And so this all links into what we're going to talk about tonight, about the whole idea of trauma, fear, and the trauma vortex. So with that in mind, let's get started here. I'm just going to double check really quickly. Make sure everybody's getting along. So here, we'll start talking about trauma. So everybody experiences trauma in their life. What is trauma for a little baby is not trauma for an adult. What's trauma for a young child is not trauma for a teenager. What's trauma for a teenager is, a trauma for someone in their old age. Trauma is anything that causes a person to sense that their life or their security is somehow being threatened, that they're being threatened with pain or whatever. And the danger, whether it's real or perceived, basically creates a cascade of reactions in the nervous system and the glandular system, which includes the release of cortisol from the adrenals, the release of epinephrine from the adrenals, and also in the sympathetic nervous system, all of which is designed to create a very tense, hyper-alert state, which is actually a protective mechanism of the body to help you deal with that moment of trauma. And this is basically the cascade that goes on. You perceive the danger. The hypothalamus in the brain releases CRH, which releases the adrenocorticotropic hormone, which releases glucocorticoids, primarily cortisol, from the adrenals. Also, there's a cascade of epinephrine, norepinephrine, but primarily epinephrine. Norepinephrine is similar to epinephrine, but it's the one that kind of keeps you normally awake and alert. Epinephrine is the alarm system. This creates the stress reaction that puts you on hyper alert. And what happens at this point is largely involuntary. You don't have conscious control over it. Basically, what happens is a part of your brain, which is believed to be the amygdala, hijacks your higher brain functions. It literally kind of shuts down your rational thought processes temporarily and causes you to react on instinct rather than on rational thought. And this allows for the instinctual part of your brain to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life or death in a particular crisis. And so this is a really useful mechanism. And the problem is when you don't come out of it, and I'll explain that in a minute. There's really only 3 instinctive reactions. So in other words, when this particular response takes over, you have only 3 involuntary reactions. One is you fight. So anger is one of those involuntary reactions. You get really angry and you want to fight back and fight to protect yourself against whatever is threatening to hurt you. That's one instinctive reaction. Another instinctive reaction is to flee, to run away, to get away, to basically escape what is hurting you. The third involuntary reaction happens when there is no clear avenue for flight, and there's also no clear avenue for fight. And so you freeze. And the freeze state is the thing that causes what we're going to talk about tonight, the long-term trauma. Because what the freeze state does is it immobilizes you in a highly tense, highly hyperactive state, prepared for the opportunity to fight or flee. Now, we've got 2 small dogs in the house and a cat. And one few months ago, I don't know whether the cat catches them or the dog catches them, but the dog always seems to wind up with the mice and the gophers. There was a mouse, and the dog was batting around playing with it, and my wife said it's dead, and I said it's not, because I didn't think the dog was actually trying at that point to eat the mouse. It was just toying with it, because what predators will do is they'll instinctively attack something that's moving, but if they're not really hungry, they'll kind of bat it around and whatever. And so the prey will go into this freeze state. The prey will become immobile, as if it's dead. The whole body is just lying limp. And I actually wound up getting the mouse and getting rid of it, but it was still alive. It was just frozen. And this is so that if the predator gets bored and walks away or something, then suddenly the prey, the mouse, can spring into action and be gone. And this is a protective effect in nature. Now, I've experienced this myself, and one of the stories I like to tell that illustrates this is some years back, I was hiking on the Pine Valley Mountain with my son on the 4th of July. And we're walking down the trail, and all of a sudden I heard the of a rattlesnake. And I didn't think about it. My whole body froze. And there I saw, like about 8-10 feet in front of me on the trail, a big rattlesnake curled up on a rock, poised to strike with the tail rattling in the air. And I just froze. And I stayed there frozen until the rattlesnake, perceiving that it wasn't moving, basically uncoiled and slithered off in the background. And then it was like, oh, did you see that? Okay, again. And I came out of the freeze reaction. you come out of the freeze reaction with basically an emotional discharge, a discharge of the emotional tension, because you've been in this highly tense, hyper alert state with all these stress hormones running through your body, and your body wants to discharge all that when the moment of danger has passed. And so, I'm sitting here, oh, okay, right. That often happens if maybe you're in a near accident on the highway. You do the same kind of thing. Now, according to Peter Levine, that I got this information from, a psychologist who extensively studied this, he says that wild animals do not become traumatized by stressful events. In other words, if this rabbit or little animal in the tiger's mouth isn't dead, and the tiger gets bored with it and it runs off, it is not going to remain traumatized or upset for forever. It's actually going to be able to go back to leading a normal life. Wild animals seem to recover quite rapidly and very successfully from traumatic events, whereas human beings don't. Human beings seem to, a traumatic event happens, and we sit there and we hold onto it, and we don't ever seem to be able to recover from it. And years later, it's still affecting us, and it's still affecting us emotionally and causing us to be angry or sad or depressed or whatnot. Why is this the case? Well, the answer, as he explains it, is that the animal has no impulse to prevent the traumatic discharge that happens after a traumatic event like this. And he explains it like this. He says, after narrowly escaping the attack of a lion, the gazelle rejoins the herd where safety and compassionate support are provided. It trembles and breathes rapidly to release the trauma, then rests, then returns to grazing. So there are two steps essential to trauma recovery. The first is the discharge of the trauma, which usually involves some kind of trembling, shouting, crying, or other emotional release, and then a period of rest, because you basically have just expended a tremendous amount of energy, and you need a little chance for what's called recovery, and then you can return to normal life. These responses, just like the stress response, are genetically programmed. They're natural, they're innate, they're whatever. He says the gazelle doesn't have to think about them or discuss them with other gazelles, it simply lets it happen, lets it run its course. As a result, the traumatic energy is released and the animal is able to put the event behind him and move on. And if you want to read more about this, you can read in an unspoken voice how the body releases trauma and restores goodness, by Peter Levine. Now, this makes me kind of linked to a poem I really like, written by Robert Burns, that most of you have probably heard a line from, but you've never actually, like a number of poems that people have heard a line from, but the line actually misses the intent of the poem. This one, the line misses the intent of the poem. So you'll see it in a minute on the next page. But it's basically on him writing about a mouse that he's overturned her nest with a plow. And he says, "We slick it, coward and timorous beastie, oh, what a panic's in thy breastie. Thou need not star away so hasty with brickler and brattle. I would be loth to run and chase thee with murder and paddle. I'm truly sorry man's dominion has broken nature's social union and justifies that ill opinion which makes thee startle at me, thy poor earth-born companion and fellow mortal. I doubt not whilst but thou might thieve. What then, poor beastie, thou might leave? A diamond thicker icker in a thrave." That's a little teeny bit of grain out of the whole grain storage. "So small request. I'll get a blessing with the lave and ne'er be missed. Thy wee bit housey to in ruin is silly while the wind's a-strewin', and nothing now to build anew of forage green, and bleak December's winds ensuing, both small and keen." Thou saw the fields laid bare and waste, and winter coming, weary winter coming fast, and cozy here beneath the blast thou thought to dwell, till crash the cruel cutler passed out through thy cell. That wee bit heap of leaves and stibble hath cost thee many a weary nibble, and now thou'st turned out for all thy trouble but a house at hold, to thole the winter's sleeken dribble and cretchen cold. But Mousie, thou art know thy lane, improving foresight may be vain. The best laid schemes of mice and men gang off to glee. There's the line that you've all heard. The best laid plans of mice and men go off astray. Although this was written in a Scottish brogue, not the modern English. And this is the important part of the poem. The best laid schemes of mice and men go off astray, and leave us not but grief and pain for promised joy. Still, thou art blessed compared with me. The present only touches thee. But ouch, I backward cast me eye on prospects drear. In other words, he saying, but I look back on the things of the past and keep, holding on to them, bringing them to the forward, worrying that they could happen again, etc. And forward, though I cannot see, I guess and fear. So what he's saying is the mouse is blessed because even though the mouse has been traumatized in the moment, the mouse is going to recover because the mouse lives in the present. The mouse doesn't live in the past. The mouse doesn't live in the future. Our trauma comes from living in the past and living in the future. And being unable to let go of the past, and therefore because we are unable to let go of the past, we are filled with fears and worries about the future. And this is the state of mankind, and this is a lot of what emotional healing is all about, is releasing the trauma so we can come back to the present. So what normally happens, as explained here, is that the stress produces a high state of alert, which is followed by a state of discharge, which releases the tension from the nervous system. And then there's a period of rebound in which you need to rest, okay? You need to pull away from life, rest, whatever, recover, and then you move into recovery. The reason human beings remain traumatized is because we have a whole bunch of social garbage that inhibits the recovery process, that makes us so that we are unable to go through the discharge process and have that time of rest and recovery that we need. So you see, if I'm able to successfully cope with a difficult situation, to either overcome it, fight it, or escape it, whatever, then the body discharges the tension in the fighting or escaping, and the system's able to return to equilibrium. And what the result of that is confidence that I can face similar circumstances in the future and overcome them. So every time I successfully cope with a traumatic experience, it increases my feeling of self-confidence, self-worth, and self-strength. But every time I unsuccessfully cope with a stressful experience, it has an opposite effect on me. And this always happens when we freeze. So the freeze response is very common in children because they feel very helpless. They feel incapable of fighting back, especially if you have an abusive or traumatic parent or something bad has happened that you see no way to be able to fix it or whatever. You freeze. Now, if the child gets into a place where they feel safe, whatever, then they're going to go through a discharge. They're going to cry. They're going to have a temper tantrum. They're going to tremble and shake. They're going to their body is going to in some way react to discharge this tension. But if their body doesn't discharge the tension, then this tension is held in the body in forms what I call, and other people have called it too, emotional armoring. The tension in the body makes me unable to move freely through life and through situations because I'm sitting here holding on to all this stuff from the past through the tension in my body that I cannot allow a successful discharge. So there are actually 4 discharge mechanisms for trauma. The first is expressions of anger, which can involve, now this is not words. Understand, this is not verbal. This is not talking about what happened to me. This is not verbally talking about it. This is actually engaging with it emotionally that causes the body to react in a way that releases the muscle tension that's associated with the trauma. And so the anger is released by shouting, kicking, yelling, punching, stomping one's feet, in other words, expressing, kind of that sort of thing. I want to mention as I'm talking about this, that for many years, I had encountered through the work of Alexander Lowen this idea of body armoring, and it fit with what I had seen happening, and I understood mechanisms for discharging anger, punching, shouting, blah blah blah. I understood the grieving mechanism about the sobbing, blah blah blah, but I didn't understand how the body discharged fear until I read Peter Levine's work, and then I recognized that it's trembling, shaking, trembling, wringing one's hand. Remember that the trauma is making me want to go, what do I do? And so that shakiness that you feel in anxiety is actually a freeze response. Anytime you're experiencing anxiety, you're initiated or locked into a freeze reaction. It's a fear response for which you do not know what to do. In other words, what action to take with your body to deal with the thing that's threatening you, that's causing you stress and trauma. So you've got the crying, the wailing, the screaming, and then you've got the shaking, trembling, and so forth. And then the fourth one is actually laughter. Laughter is the release of shame, because it's the ability to find humor in what otherwise would be kind of an embarrassing, shameful situation. All of these are ways the body has of discharging tension from difficult circumstances and restoring equilibrium. But as I've maintained through this whole thing, we practice emotional allopathy on each other, and all these things are socially unacceptable. You just don't do this. You don't. A little kid throwing a temper tantrum, that's awful. How come you can't control your child? A little kid trembling, well, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? We got to stop this. Okay, don't be afraid. It's okay. Blah blah blah. Crying, a little kid crying. I mean, it's unsettling to hear someone cry. And so we don't want to see it, and especially see if we have armor. If we have armor against crying, we have armor against fear, we have armor against anger, then seeing that kind of a discharge from a child on that touches that energy in us and makes that want to happen for us. And therefore we want to stop it because we're trying to suppress it in ourselves. We got to suppress it in other people. And that's why we get into this problem. We don't have the ability to just be naturally compassionate with each other and let the person go through their process and be supportive of them. We get scared and we want to inhibit, we want to fix it, we want to make it go away. We don't want it to be allowed to happen because we can't do that because, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? So I want to explain this even a little bit better. That when you express an emotion, when you're crying, when you're shouting, when you're trembling, whatever, that is not the emotion. The emotion is the energetic state of the body that is driving that. That expression of emotion is the discharge or release of the emotion. It's the letting go of the emotion. It's really equivalent to what I learned about physical healing, that the runny nose, the diarrhea, the vomiting, etc., were the body curing itself of the disease. Then in the same way, the crying, the whatever, is the release of the pain, tension, trauma, and part of the recovery process. So, but when we've been trained to think that these things are negative, that they're bad, that if we're doing this, something is wrong with us, that we're somehow deficient or weak or bad or whatever, we learn then to stuff this and say, I can't do that because I don't want to be bad, I don't want to be wrong, I don't want to be shamed, I don't want to be judged by other people. And so we learn to, we start off with other people doing things that inhibit this, and then we internalize the inhibition. And therefore we remain stuck. And the emotion becomes negative because it cannot be eliminated from the system. It's like a toxin that you're holding on to that stays with you for years and years and years. And they still try to discharge, but they try to discharge in unhealthy ways, which are blaming others for how we feel, being harsh and judgmental with ourselves or with others, tension in our bodies, excess weight, and even physical illnesses. Chronic physical illnesses can be expressions of these stuck emotions. So when we experience chronic emotional stress, it's because we're stuck in this cycle of helplessness and fear. We are unable to connect with the emotions that we're feeling. We're unable to acknowledge what we're feeling, and we're unable to let our body discharge it. So we feel stuck. And feeling stuck, we feel trapped. There's no escape. There's no way to ever fix this because the avenue of escape is blocked. Understand? We've learned to inhibit the very thing that would get us well. This is really critical to understand. It's really, really critical to understand. The reason why we remain stuck in trauma is because we've been trained to inhibit the very process that would help us get well, help us recover from it. So Peter Levine has this idea of what he calls the trauma vortex. And I'm going to explain this concept because I think it is a very good explanation of what happens. You have a triggering event. Again, the triggering event is something that we perceived as a danger, a threat to our existence, a threat to our livelihood, something that traumatized us. Whether that trauma was real or not, meaning that whether the threat was actually a real threat or it was just a threat that we perceived as a threat, doesn't matter. We perceived it as a threat, and therefore we reacted to it with stress, with trauma. So the triggering event creates a stress reaction, and there is an attempt to fight or flee from the perceived danger. If I successfully fight or flee from the danger, that ends it. That doesn't create a trauma vortex. What creates the trauma vortex is if I go into a freeze reaction because I can't perceive any way to fight or flee or deal with the trauma. I feel helpless. And then still I'm not in a trauma vortex. What creates the trauma vortex now is that I never come to a place where I feel safe in discharging the trauma. And therefore, because I feel unable to discharge the trauma, it remains stuck in my body in the form of muscle tension or emotional armoring that basically is there constantly in my system waiting to be re-triggered. So what happens is then re-triggering events occur, and a re-triggering event is an event that the brain perceives as having similarity to the original triggering event. That stimulates the stress reaction again, which again, am I able to fight or flee? Do I perceive myself as helpless? Go in the freeze reaction, unable to discharge. And so what happens is if I'm not able to do the discharge, then the re-triggering event is added to the triggering event, and you start piling up these triggers. We call them buttons. Someone pushes our buttons and we get angry, or pushes our buttons and we feel sad, or we pushes our buttons and we experience anxiety. That's what we're talking about. Those buttons are this collection of triggering events that, because we unsuccessfully coped with the situation, it triggers a stress reaction from which we do not know how to escape. And now I got this little concept of this thing. It was written by a different author, not Peter Levine, but it's describing the same process. And it's a little book by Harvey Jenkins called The Human Side of Human Beings. And in it, he talks about this story of a child getting separated from their mother in a shopping mall. I'm just going to pause the presentation here for a minute. And so, of course, the child is very terrified that, this is maybe a 2-year-old child or something. And they're scared and they're kind of helpless and whatever. And finally, they get reunited with the mom and they start to cry. Now, they haven't cried maybe through this whole thing because they've been like so traumatized, they don't know what to do. But as soon as they feel safe, they go into the trauma discharge and they start to bawl and cry. So mom not understanding this, or mom having issues with crying herself, may show either overt or covert behaviors that let the child know that this behavior is unacceptable, that mother doesn't like it, mother doesn't want to see it. So, I mean, that could be like overt, as in, oh, stop crying, don't be a baby, you're okay, blah, 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 or, getting angry or upset or whatever with the child. Or it could be in the form of exhibiting this misdirected sympathy. They're there, it's okay, mommy's here, don't cry, please don't cry, blah, 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 that kind of thing, which isn't like exhibiting anger towards the child, but it's actually still encouraging the child to stop the process. And or it could be that the mom doesn't even say anything, but the mom just tenses up and feels, because she's got all this emotional armor against crying inside of herself, she just tenses up and gets rigid, and the child feels the rigidity in the mother and realizes they're doing something that the mother finds inappropriate, and therefore the child tries to back out to avoid the mother's disapproval. So the only response that would actually help the child is just lovingly holding the child in arms and just letting them cry and letting them go through their process until they get over it. Just to I'm going to come back to the story in a second. I just want to take an aside and explain that this is not an impossible thing to do. It just, in our culture, just seems so weird to behave like that. Because in this book called The Continuum Concept, about a lady who lived for a couple of years with South American tribe that hadn't had much exposure to Western civilization, she describes a thing where a young man in his early 20s got gangrene on his toes. They were far away from any medical facility, and she cut the gangrene off with a pocket knife without any anesthesia. And the young man was laid his head on his young wife's lap. So remember, these are both young people in their early 20s. And he's screaming and blubbering like a baby from the pain of having this flesh cut off of his toes. Okay? And she's just calmly holding him and stroking his hair and not saying anything and not alarmed and not worried and not distressed in the slightest, just being supportive and loving. And the village, a lot of the other villagers, in response to the screams, all came and gathered around. None of them expressed disapproval. None of them showed anything like of being stressed or traumatized themselves over this. They were just all there to lovingly support this guy as he went through this traumatic event. In other words, there was no shame. There was no shaming, judgment, etc., attached to the fact that he was crying because he was in pain. It's like, grow up, be a man, and don't, men don't do that. Well, all that kind of, none of it was there. So that tells you something's really wrong with our society, right? If people could actually do that, and we in our society can't do that, there's something really screwed up in most of us. And she talks about that in the book, The Continuum Concept. So back to the story of the little kid. So mom somehow inhibits the child from crying, makes the child feel like they can't cry, and the child stuffs it, which causes emotional armoring. Now, the abandonment from mom is the triggering event, right? So a few days later, mom goes to leave this kid with a babysitter. And so the kid is about to be threatened with the same trauma or a related trauma to the original triggering event. And so immediately that re-triggers the trauma. The child begins to cry, blah, 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 be very emotionally upset, and maybe they undergo like the same kind of shaming or encouragement not to do this or blah, 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 blah. And so they learn to stuff it. And what happens is the child builds a trauma vortex around abandonment. So, and here's what you want to understand. Everything that's associated with that, like, for example, the shopping mall in which the child was originally lost, can become a triggering event for the trauma because it reminds the subconscious brain of the original triggering trauma. And every subsequent sense of abandonment, the situation, the smells, the words that were used, etc., all get added into the list of triggering events. So this is now, if the child was just allowed to cry and they discharged the trauma and they were able in a loving, supportive way to have someone just helping them, then the child would, once they got it out of their system and they're safe and whatever in mama's arms, they would realize everything's okay. I'm fine. I wasn't injured. I've survived. And what would happen then is the child then has confidence that the next time something bad happens, there's this idea that everything's going to be okay. But because the child wasn't allowed to do that, there's this sense of like, I'm hurt, I'm scared, I can't cry because blah, blah. So what it does is it creates this feeling of helplessness and problems that perpetuates itself. Now, all of us, and I really want to make this really clear, that all of us have trauma vortexes. We call them buttons. People push our buttons. We think that it's what the other people are doing that's causing us to go and wig out, when in reality, it's our unresolved trauma vortexes that are being triggered. It has nothing to do with what the other people, oftentimes the other person has no even idea that what they just said or did is related to some kind of trauma in us. And they meant nothing, okay? But we get triggered. These are like eddies in the stream of life. See the little whirlpools where there's something stuck in you. It's like your energy is like a flowing river, right? But you get this little block in here, this little unresolved trauma, and it forms like a little thing that creates an eddy in your emotional energy that you get caught in, and you spin around in, and you have a hard time getting out of. It's like having a splinter or a pebble in a wound that is inhibiting the wound from being able to heal. And so when something triggers you into your trauma vortex, you go into a downward spiral of negative thoughts and emotions. You go out of control because the amygdala hijacks your rational brain and pulls you into a fight, flight, freeze reaction. And you become a emotional basket case, if you will, of reactivity, and your ability to be rational is severely inhibited. The argument would be that people we consider mentally ill are people who've developed so many trauma vortexes that you're literally what we call walking on eggshells when you're around them, because you never know what's going to set them off, because there are so many triggering events that they're triggered by just practically life in general. So how do you tell when you're in a trauma vortex or someone else is in a trauma vortex. Well, the first sign is that the thoughts and words are incoherent. They're incoherent because the person has not been able to find meaning in the original triggering event. So in other words, there's a lack of rational thought processes taking place. You can't reason someone out of a trauma vortex because their rational mind is not operating in a trauma vortex. All this stuff is really, really important to understand. So the expressions of the things that a person says when they're in trauma vortex, things you say when you're in trauma vortex, are exaggerations and metaphors. They're completely illogical. And one of those is absolutes. Everybody does this. Nobody does that. This is always the case. It's never that way. It's always this way. Blah, blah. That right there is a sign of being illogical because you never do this or you always do that. Hey, nobody always does one thing and never does another thing. You're unable to see things clearly. And as all of these things are the person's attempt to explain verbally their feelings because they don't feel safe showing their feelings, but that is expressing their feelings through their body. So they're stuck in their brain, whirling around in their brain, trying to deal with this. Now, I experienced this. Let me just see if I go to the next slide. Okay. Allowing the discharge. Okay. We have to find safe space to discharge these suppressed emotions and work our way out of our trauma vortexes. You can't work your way out of a trauma vortex with your mind. You have to work your way out of it by tuning into the feelings, discharging them. And if there are certain kinds of things that happen to us, either things that happen to us in early childhood that were really traumatic, like being severely physically or sexually abused or stuff like that, or certain kinds of really, really serious trauma, like I worked with two people who saw their spouse murdered in front of their eyes. Someone who's been in war or some other thing that's extremely serious, traumatizing event. Typically, you need a supportive person to be what I think of as like a surrogate parent, like the parent that you didn't have, that is just holding you in a loving space to allow you to go through this process, to make it safe for you to go through this process, because you're scared to go through this process because you think that you're going insane and you're falling apart and you're breaking down. Well, you are falling apart. Your armor's falling apart. All of your rationality is falling apart. But if you could allow your body to discharge this thing, then you can feel it and work your way through it on the feeling level and heal it. What you are in denial with, or what you're trying to make other people responsible for, or even blaming yourself for, blame and denial do not heal these things. You have to let the process of discharge take place to clear your body and clear your brain so you can think rationally again. And then you'll be able to make sense of things and find your way back into a state where you are not traumatized anymore. So once I understood this, okay, then I've really seen what Peter Levine is talking about here in doing work with people. I've seen this spontaneous trembling. It's one thing that I actually do not know how to. I can act. Okay, I can go through the motions of anger. I can go through the motions of grief. I can do a pretty good thing of demonstrating the sobbing, moaning of grief. I could the discharge of anger. I cannot do the involuntary trembling. I've literally watched people, just this upper arm muscle is going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth like that, and I can't make it happen because it's just going like this. Okay, but I've seen it, and once I became aware of it, I started to recognize what that was. And I started to be able to encourage people to just let it happen, Trembling constitutes a contained discharge of trauma, and by allowing these powerful sensations to unfold while being aware of them and their purpose, one can gradually restore equilibrium to the nervous system. Spontaneous trembling is nearly always accompanied by rapid breathing, which also helps to release trauma. The shaking and trembling we experience following traumatic experiences are part of the innate process of resetting the nervous system and restoring our psyche to wholeness. If we become frightened by these sensations and resist them, we block our return to nervous equilibrium and mental and emotional wholeness, and the remaining trauma inside of us becomes frozen. It's really, really critical to understand. So, just a few weeks ago, a little over a month ago, I was in Nevada, over by Lake Tahoe, to see my wife's oldest son get married, and I got into a car accident. It's the first time I've ever been in an actual moving car accident like that I was actually the person who was responsible. I did not see the car that had stopped in the lane ahead of me in time. And when I slammed on the brakes, I realized I was going to rear end them. The oncoming lane was clear. I tried to turn into the oncoming lane. They were actually turning left, and they turned left at the same time. I was turning the oncoming lane, and I turned even more sharply, and we sideswiped each other. Fortunately, I wasn't injured, and neither was she, and both of our cars were actually repairable. My car wasn't damaged to the point that it wasn't drivable, but I was shaken up. I remember trying to call, I called 911, and I'm sitting here trying to describe what's happening, and I'm having a hard time forming words. I'm having a hard time saying anything because I'm in shock. And they say, "Are you okay?" Yeah, I'm okay. Blah blah blah. But I was just, my whole body was shaking. My whole body was trembling. In other words, I was severely traumatized. Because I was, felt like, I just come close to possibly killing somebody. It was scary, and I can only imagine what had happened if the accident had been worse and actually had killed the other person or severely injured the other person or whatever. The trauma from that would even be worse, right? And so, but one of the things that really helped here is understanding that all that trembling and what was going on was something that had to happen. It had to happen. And I remember when I was by myself a little later on, back at the condo where we were staying, and I'm still feeling that anxiety. I went in and I deliberately let myself get into it. And I can't tell you how much better I felt when I let that happen. When I was in a situation where I could just really allow myself to just go with it and let go of it. And up until I did that, my brain was replaying what had happened over and over and over and over again. Okay? I was constantly like my brain was trying to figure out, how could I have avoided that? How could that have been different? Blah, 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 circling around. Okay. In other words, I was caught into the trauma. And when I finally got into a position where I could, let my body discharge the tension and fall asleep and whatnot, my brain started to stop circling back through the trauma. And this is my experience of working with this kind of stuff. If I can help the person get to the point where their body can discharge the tension that they're holding on to, on all that stuff, and work through the process, then equilibrium and peace is possible to come back to the person. Like I said, just one of my interns, I might have mentioned this, but I want to just say it again. He gave me a case study. And the guy had been involved in the Vietnam War, and he couldn't forgive himself for the people he'd killed. He felt like I'll never be able to forgive myself. And when the guy was finally able to get him in touch with the pain, and this guy was a PhD in psychology, by the way, that my student was working with. When he was finally able to actually get in touch with the emotions, and he bawled and he expressed his anger and he got all that emotional tension out of his body, he actually got to the point where he actually was able to perceive the light of God and feel the love of God and feel the forgiveness of God pour through him, and he had peace for the first time in years. But my experience is that you can't get to that point when you're in denial. When you're in denial, when you're trying to suppress and whatever all that emotional energy, you remain forever trapped in this trauma vortex. And every time something reminds you of it, your brain goes into spin, around and around and around, reliving, going over and over and over the event in your brain, and you can't let go of it. And so this is why I call this emotional healing. Okay. It's a body healing. It's a spiritual healing. It's a mental healing, but I call it an emotional healing because the key point, what I learned to do, was to help create safe space for a person to really get in touch with, express their feelings, not just in words, but express their feelings through their body and process things so they could come out of it with mental clarity and rediscover peace and harmony in their life. And that is, the core of this thing. So let's look at some questions before we end here. Yeah. Okay. You can. Okay. Like when you're feeling anxiety, all right. When you're feeling anything, okay. The key is to, instead of fighting it, tune into the feeling, tune into the sensation, breathe into it, and whatever the movement that your body's trying to make, kind of set it free, let it happen. So if you're feeling anxiety, you're feeling shaky inside. If you can let that shakiness come out, all right, it helps you discharge the tension. It actually helps get rid of the anxiety. And this is what, again, people are trying to do all the time. They're trying to get rid of the anxiety without letting the body move through the anxiety. And the body has to move through it. The body has, your nervous system in your physical body has to discharge the emotional tension. If it doesn't, it remains stuck in your body. And it triggers over and over again, causing these trauma vortexes. So certain things will trigger you into anger, they'll trigger you into grief, they'll trigger you into fear, they'll trigger you into shame, they'll trigger you into various emotional trauma, because you have never resolved the original trauma. And subsequently, you've added layers and layers of that through things that were associated with the original trauma. One of the questions, someone said, is that fear is mental, anger is in the gut, grief is in the heart, the emotional world. The head, heart, body, the three emotions in balance: fear, grief, and anger. The physical body is what creates separation. The emotional creates connection. The mind is what allows us to navigate with all that. So the grief is the feeling of disconnection from the heart. Anger, the feeling of being threatened on a physical level and wanting to fight or push or get rid of it. So grief is the feeling of missing something and wanting it. Anger is the feeling of not wanting something, and fear is the sense of threat to our existence, which can involve grief, anger, or just plain freezing. Okay. Okay, someone says, I came in a little late, but how could you help a child who has a lot of trauma, loss of parent or similar? Well, the whole point is that, and this is where I think the magic happens. As you become comfortable with your own emotions and you are able to process through your own emotions, you become a very clear channel for when other people are upset. Like I said in the thing in the continuum concept of the people in that village, they were not traumatized by the fact that this guy was in pain. They just were empathetic, compassionate. Okay, they understood. Sometimes you have pain in life, and we just need to be here to support you. But they weren't alarmed that, this shouldn't be, blah 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 blah, or he shouldn't be crying about it, or any of that kind of stuff. There wasn't any judgment. There was just this empathetic process. Well, as you become, and especially, I started off this whole series, talking about my connection of this with my experience with Christ. As you become a greater conduit for God's unconditional love, and you're just sitting there. I've had people, and they'll sit and start talking to me, and just they sense this safety about me. Like as soon as a person starts to feel like someone's really listening and they really care or whatever, they will almost instinctively start dropping into their stuff, because the intuitive sense of the body is that it wants to heal. And here's an opportunity to heal. And all I'm doing, I'm not healing them. I'm simply creating safe space for them to go through the healing process. Understand? The healing process is innate. It's just like, a person cuts themselves. All right. I can't heal the cut. You can't heal the cut. None of us can heal the cut. The innate ability to heal the cut is in the intelligence that God put into the body itself. But you can clean the dirt out of the cut, and you can put a bandage over it, and you can do something to assist the process. But all of that is just to make sure that nothing is blocking the healing process. The healing process is innate. So when you're doing emotional healing work, all you're doing is creating the environment that people feel safe enough that they can actually go into this place that they're afraid to go and start dealing with this. And you can lovingly draw it out of them and help them to go through that process. And they're the ones who do the healing process. It's innate inside of them. It's not you. You're just creating the loving environment that makes it safe for them to do so, because nobody else is doing that. Everybody else is judging, criticizing, trying to fix them, trying to tell them what they need to do to change so that they don't feel that way anymore, and all blah, 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 blah. Understand? But the ability to just be there, compassionately listening, understanding, and letting a person go through what they need to go through in a supportive, helpful way is the key to this whole thing. Someone asks a really good question. How can one be empathetic without eventually it getting to you, so to speak? Well, first of all, let me tell you, it's the people that it's most difficult to be empathetic with are the people you are closest to: your spouse, your children, your parents, your siblings, those people. The reason why that is the case is because your trauma vortexes are tied up with their trauma vortexes. So it's very hard to be clear when you're working with them. But basically, being empathetic only gets to you when it's triggering your stuff. The reason it gets to you is because you have an issue similar to the issue that you're trying to be empathetic with. And therefore, as you're empathizing with them, you are also opening up the junk inside of you. So like I said, one of the main things that I really found in doing this work was that if you are not comfortable dealing with your own anger, other people's anger will trigger you. If you're not comfortable dealing with your own grief and sadness, other people's grief and sadness will fear you. If anything that you're encountering outside of yourself is merely a reflection of what you haven't dealt with inside of yourself. So That's why it's really important in this work to always be working on yourself. Okay? Because as you work on yourself and as you learn to connect more with the unconditional love of God and let that unconditional love of God flow in you and through you, that really, really is what does the healing work. It isn't you. You're like a conduit for it, a doorway through it. It isn't you. You can't take any credit for it. Like I tell people when they come to the emotional workshops or whatever, I don't do this. I sometimes sit back and go, what just happened? That was amazing. It's as healing to me as it is to the people I'm working on, because it's something that's innate in us that I'm allowing to happen, not fighting, not trying to take control of. And that's the real key. I say the clearer I've become, the less triggered I am. And every time when something is bothering me, and it's going on in the family, I always realize this is a sign. This is like God saying, you're not there yet. You have stuff you need to work on still, right? And so I have to go to work on myself, because if I go to work and I heal that inside of me, if I remove the beam from my own eye, then it's easy to help the neighbor with the dust speck in theirs. But if I'm focused on the dust speck in theirs and not recognizing the beam in my own eye, the thing that's interfering with me being clear, I don't. So when I'm having trouble with something outside of me, it's because I'm having trouble with that thing inside of me. And that's what I need to go to God in prayer. I need to do some meditation. I need to do some internal healing on myself in order to be able to become clear so that I can help a person outside of myself. The question on anger, you need to go back and look at the previous webinars, because we talked about anger in the first two webinars in this series. And so you go back and I give all kinds of tools for basically dealing with anger. And then we also talked about, grief and sadness. And all of these videos are on YouTube. So also, if you go to our class page, if you register at the Modern Herbal Medicine LMS, Learning Management System at Modern Herbal Medicine, I post the videos in there. I also post the handouts in there, and sometimes some additional reading materials. So if you're having trouble with that, please let me know. Also, just so you know, all Microsoft email programs, Hotmail, I think MSN, and one more are being blocked by our email from our email program, or we've somehow gotten their spam list. So if you're not getting emails from us, because I do send out emails to the classes, if you're in one of those servers, that's why. If you'll email me privately at abcherb@mac.com, abcherb@mac.com, I can email you information on getting into the learning management system and the link to the Herbal Education YouTube channel, where you can watch all of these webinars. I'll go through this entire program. This is a course. This is a free course. Module 1 is up on YouTube and in the Learning Center. This is Module 2. We have 2 more lessons to go on Module 2. And then later in July, we'll be starting Module 3. And you be able to go through this entire program. And then I would encourage you, if you want more help, to come to one of our emotional healing workshops, because it's there where we actually do work with you and work with other people, and you really see this process in operation. Okay. Okay, let's see. Yeah, when people who just went to our workshop just saying that they had a great experience. It was wonderful. I'll have you sometime, Cash, tell that story. Anyway, It was so fun to listen to. Now, no, I mean, people have amazing healing experiences doing this work. Amazing healing experiences. I mean, literally, I'm blown away at what happens with people when they go through this process. And the fact that I have people who have studied under me who are successfully doing this with other people means it can be learned. You can learn to do this. It's not something magical with me. It's a process that as you learn to work with this inside of you, you become better and better at working out with other people. And we need to spread this work out because there are so many people who need help. Well, I'm trying to hold these down to an hour, and I've gone 5 minutes over, but we're back on the air. We'll be back next week. We'll continue our discussion with fear, talking about courage as an antidote to fear and how you exercise courage and how you work through fear. And so I look forward to sharing that information with you next week. And so good night, and I'll talk to you again next Monday.